No COVID vaccine is going to save this planet from the upheaval to our livelihoods. Even if, under a best-case scenario, there is a roaring recovery, entire industries will never be the same. And that digital acceleration during lockdown means that many jobs will never return. Now, to soften the blow, most of the West is printing money and putting it in consumers' pockets, like the United States, which sent out recently stimulus checks of $1,200 to every taxpayer over the summer. Now, enter France, which Thursday announced Europe's biggest recovery plan to date, 100 billion euros, but decided to buck the trend, offering tax breaks for businesses to go green and bring industry home. Will Emmanuel Macron's France First approach work? Will it really revive manufacturing at home or simply line the pockets of shareholders? And what about that digital transformation? As the economy reels, business has never been better for U.S. tech giants. Where does that leave the whole GAFA tax concept? And more broadly, does Macron's plan do enough to address the kind of growing imbalances that for the last few years have led to, for instance, the Yellow Vest movements and last year's major strikes in this country? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Emmanuel Macron's gamble. Joining us, Francesco Saracino, Deputy Director of the French Political Science Institute Sciences Po's Economic Research Center, OFCE. Thanks for joining us.
Hi.
Also with us, Agnès Michel, member of the editorial board of the Terra Nova think tank. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
He is the director of the Paris office of the European Investment Bank, Grégoire Chauvière-Le Drian. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And with us as well, France 24 business editor, Stephen Carroll. How are you, Stephen?
I'm good, Francois. Glad to be here.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter. The hashtag is F24debate. 100 billion euros over 2 years with a mix of public investments, subsidies, and tax cuts. And again, a path that's very different from, for instance, neighboring Germany. Yuka Royer has more.
The French government is spending big. The 100 billion euro stimulus plan will be largely financed by public debt, with just about 40 billion euros coming from the European Recovery Fund. Still, the Prime Minister has categorically ruled out austerity.
Il est économiquement et socialement infiniment préférable de dégrader temporairement les soldes publics pour investir, réarmer l'économie et repartir de l'avant, plutôt que de s'enfoncer dans l'austérité, laisser exploser le chômage, la misère et les drames humains.
Unlike in Germany, which launched an even bigger stimulus package with a cut in VAT, France's new plan does little to directly support consumers. It focuses on helping businesses, especially the industrial, construction and transport sectors. 34 billion euros will go to helping companies struggling to recover from the health crisis. 36 billion euros will be spent on jobs, health and social programs with an emphasis on youth employment. And 30 billion euros have been earmarked to help industry go greener. France's GDP shrank by 13.8% in the second quarter and is expected to see an 11% drop in 2020 as a whole. The ambitious recovery plan aims to bring the economy back to pre-COVID levels within 2 years.
Et nous étions devenus la nation la plus attractive de tous les pays européens sans exception. C'est ce qui me fait dire aux Français, nous allons y arriver. Tout simplement parce que nous y sommes déjà arrivés il n'y a pas si longtemps.
The coronavirus crisis revealed France's dependence on foreign suppliers. The new plan includes financial incentives to get companies bring production back to France and create more jobs.
Let me begin with you, Stephen Carroll, because there's this whole question of why France chose a different path from Germany. Why didn't it slash VAT, for instance, get stimulus to get people to spend more money, citizens to spend more money?
Look, it's a choice that every government's having to make in a crisis, is where they're going to put their stimulus, and they try to direct it in a way where they feel it'll be most effective. The French government's argument in this case is that because of the furlough scheme that operated in France, which meant that most people kept their revenues kept their income during lockdown, that people's spending power wasn't diminished as much as it might have been otherwise. And as a result, people actually saved an awful lot more money. The expectation is there'll be 100 billion extra in savings for this year by French households. And what they really want to do is incentivize people to spend that. And what the government's argument is that the best way you can do that is to give people confidence that they're going to be able to keep their jobs in the future and they're going to have a salary in the future. And that's what's going to incentivize them to spend. The German government, as you mentioned, went a different way. They cut VAT because they felt that that would incentivize people to spend. We've seen the UK announce schemes, for example, for discounts on meals to get people to spend on that. The Irish government has a scheme to help people spend on tourism, on domestic tourism in Ireland. So every government's making these choices. The French government, though, went for a supply side package. They're looking at trying to stimulate business in the hope that that will maintain jobs and thus maintain people's salaries.
It's a bit the world upside down, Francesco Saracino. The French are doing supply-side economics, and the Germans are telling consumers to spend.
Yes, I mean it's kind of logical though, because I mean the support to the income of households will eventually fade out because it's very costly, and the government cannot keep it forever. So at that point, these people need to still be to still have a job. And so, I mean, I think the balance between supply and demand in this case needed to be tilted towards supply. This is different from Germany because in Germany, as you know, regardless of incomes, savings rates are very high. So the incentive for to boost domestic demand, especially when Germany cannot count on exports as it could in the past, seems more reasonable. But I mean, I've been opposed to supply-side policies in other situations, but in this case, I think the government is targeting. As it was said before, it's targeting the right policies, because what is important is that once the support and the temporary employment schemes fade out, and they will eventually, it's important that firms do not lay off workers, and because that would make the recession even deeper than it is already.
So there is a French exception, Agnès Michel, and do you agree with Francesco?
Yes, the thing is that savings in France are very high. I'm not a specialist on European savings, so I can't make a comparison. But in France, we already had, during the 20 last years, a very high amount, not even only in buildings and houses, but also in assets from people. Personal savings, liquid savings, as we say, like in the bank, in some investment, financial investment, and so there is a lot of money that already wasn't spent, and you have 100 millions that come to sum up with that. So the issue is not to make people use that money. I mean, the population that has saving, which is not the entire population, of course, but make the economy stable. The Prime
Minister says to safeguard jobs.
Yes, stable, and so not destroy jobs and activity, which goes, stability and not destruction. And so that is the right path. The thing is that maybe the path would have been better if the step was a little bit higher, and I don't think it is, but I suppose it's
what could have been
subject.
higher?
The transition. We're supposed to have green investments. The definition of green could be a debate by itself, but you don't feel, at least as as an ecologist, I don't feel a real transformation of the economical views of this government. There is a good example. They plan to make you, people that can, buy new cars, more ecological cars, green cars, but this is a lot of energy waste to create those cars. A real transformation would have been to invest a lot in cycles, in bicycles, in building them, because we almost have no industry to build them in France. We have very high-level cycles in France, but not the usual one for everybody. And you have a lot of creation of jobs with the repair of cycles. So that is a real transformation. It's not paint your car in green. It's change your mobility. And that would be the real transformation.
So, Grégoire Chauvière-Le-Drian, France is ruled by this elite, right? It's a mix of people who've gone to this elite administration school and those who've gone to a Polytechnic, which is this great engineering school.
Quite caricatural, but...
All right, but the decision makers in this country, can they think outside the box, or do they think in terms of, big industry, big state-sponsored projects, top-down initiatives?
It's not the position of the IB to comment or to judge the decision that has been made today and the choice and the balance of this plan. But for sure they do, if you want the answer. But
are you seeing in the applications you're getting thinking that's different, that's new, that's outside the box?
It's massive investment in a strong sector for the future. And if you look at the plan, for instance, transport, energy transition, and the amounts that are being proposed by the government are massive. And what we need also to underline, this is support, massive and innovative support of the EU to implement all this plan all over Europe. And the response of the EU has been innovative, unprecedented, and rapid. 2 months between the proposal of the Commission and the decision made by the European Council. Just to remember, in 2010, we need about 2 years between the financial crisis, and the setup of the ESM, European Stability Mechanism, and 5 years for the Juncker Plan to recover our investment capacity within all strategic sector and industry. Here, in less than 2 months, the EU has been in a position to propose and to implement a massive plan to recover.
Yeah, they went fast, Stephen Carroll, in part because they got roasted last time around for being too slow. And if we're talking about 100 billion euros, which is, for people who don't follow economics, a huge sum with lots of zeros behind it, well, 40 billion of that is thanks to the fact that they did go fast at the European level, since that's EU money.
Yeah, and that also encouraged, which was the whole idea, that encouraged countries like France and Germany and everyone else that we've seen doing it to come up with their own stimulus plans, because they had to be less concerned about financing them. It's interesting that money from the EU plan won't come immediately for France. In a lot of cases, the finance ministry has already acknowledged they're going to have to make the borrowing themselves up front. And that's sort of the other element of European level stimulus, is what the European Central Bank is doing by intervening in the bond markets, which is helping to keep the borrowing costs for countries like France low, which means that the French government can be less concerned about building up debt at this stage, because the cost of it is going to be relatively very low for them. So there's help coming from different quarters of the European machinery, but certainly it's good for the French government to be able to say that 40 billion of that 100 billion is going to come from the European Union. And it's certainly going to perhaps give a little bit more confidence to people that the government is going to stick to its promise that it won't raise taxes to pay for this 100 billion euro stimulus.
We're still, for those, and I'll put it to you, Francesco Saracino, for those of us who don't follow the weeds of business news, I remember a few years back when Nicolas Sarkozy was president, we were all toiling over the fact that the government had to save 30 billion euros. It seemed like a huge sum at the time. Here we're talking about 100 billion, and it doesn't seem like a big number.
Well, because the crisis is unprecedented. I mean, we when we teach macroeconomics, up until a few months ago, we used to say that the crisis of 2008 was a once-in-a-lifetime crisis that was there was nothing equivalent if we didn't go back to the 1920s. Now, 10 years later, we have a crisis that makes the 2008 crisis in terms of its size and its impact on the economy pale. It's just a blip in the data if you look it compared to this crisis. So, of course, the scale of the response needs to be much higher. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, this now, just 1 year ago, I mean, I'm Italian. Just 1 year ago, the Italian government was fighting with the Commission for a 0.1 deficit more in its budget law. Now we're talking about 4 or 5% of GDP, like that, like peanuts. So I totally agree with you. But I mean, this shows how, and also the speed of the European response, the scale of the ECB umbrella that has been opened on the public debt, the suspension of fiscal rules. I mean, all of that conveys even to the non-economist shows how unprecedented is this crisis. It has been unprecedented from a health point of view. I mean, the first months of the crisis we have been focusing on the healthcare response, and now we see that once this is unfortunately getting back more or less to normal, we see that the economic legacy of that is huge. And I mean, we will have to, I mean, you say thinking out of the box, we will need to think out of the box, which doesn't mean inventing new things. It just means taking any available tool, including those that for many years we in Europe refused to use. For example, fiscal policy. Now, nobody argues against fiscal policy. 10 years ago, it was like taboo.
Very briefly, Francesco, because we have to go to the break. We heard in that opening report the French Prime Minister talk about a temporary degrading of public accounts. In other words, we're going to build the deficit. Will it really be temporary?
Well, that's the bet. The bet of the French government, which I think is the right bet, but then they need to win it, of course, is that we will grow out of that debt. So they, as you said, they promise not to raise taxes in the future, and the hope is that if we manage to kickstart growth again, is the denominator of the ratio between debt and GDP that we grow, so the sustainability of public finances will come from extra growth and not from austerity. Of course, it's a bet, and we have to hope it works.
All right, when we come back, we're going to pick up on this issue of just how green this recovery plan is. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. How are we going to get out of this crisis with COVID bringing the world economy to a halt? France this Thursday unveiling its 100 billion euro recovery plan. We are talking about it with Francesco Saracino of the French Political Science Institute Sciences Po's Economic Research Wing, the OFCE. Also with us, Agnès Michel of the French think tank Terra Nova. We're also in the company of Grégoire Chauvière-Le Drian, director of the Paris office, the France office of the European Investment Bank, and France 24 business editor Stephen Carroll is also in our company. Just before the break, Grégoire Chauvière-Le Drian, we were talking about, the fact that here these are big plans to try to bring bring industry home, trying to, and it's important to note, I'm going to get a little bit of inside baseball here. After World War II, France had a high commissioner for planning, a commissaire au plan, who ran traffic as the country built those state-sponsored giants of engineering, electronics, and energy. The post has been revived this time around with the naming of the head of the centrist Modem party, François Bayrou, a political heavyweight who played kingmaker when he endorsed Emmanuel Macron for president. The fact that there's a high commissioner for planning that comes with this, what's your reaction?
Actually, the institution, even if the name was not Commissariat au Plan, was still existing with other naming. But it is important for France and for Europe as well to define the strategic investment that has to be made to guarantee our capacity in Europe in terms of production. We were talking about battery for electric cars, for instance. It is really good to invest in electric cars, but if we import batteries from outside, we are also in risk. And for instance, and this is the role of the European Investment Bank, we invest in enterprises who produce now battery in Finland and in Europe to relocalize in Europe strategic industry. This is also the case for agriculture and for a lot of sectors where we need to support our enterprises, European enterprise, for them to keep their activity and even to grow outside in the EU.
So we saw this at the outset of the crisis, and it was something becried, but even by the French finance minister, the fact that so many of the key sectors just mentioned there by Grégoire, and we can include in that, by the way, pharmaceuticals. The stuff is made elsewhere, very often in China. Agnès Michel, does this plan shorten supply chains? Do you think it will work?
Well, proximity in production is obviously the key to face that kind of crisis we just lived with the COVID, and to create jobs, and to ensure a transparency on the quality of the products that you actually consume. We had a lot of scandals about some toys for children or some other products that were not really made for consumption. So it's a real solution in the whole way. You can see about every I don't know how to say it, but it's the perfect solution. But it can't be a French solution. If I'm not wrong, 2/3 of the exchange in Europe are within Europe. So it means that the decision of making a real market is and resilient market, producing everything we need for a day-to-day basis, has to be done and planned at a European level.
Let me ask Stephen Carroll, because you recently attended, the annual end of summer seminar of French business leaders just outside of Paris, or actually this year was at Longchamp Racecourse, I think. And I wanted to ask you, did you get a sense that this idea of shortening supply chains was this sort of nationalist make in France discourse, or as Agnès Michel said, it's more make in Europe?
I don't think there was a huge make in France sentiment. There's definitely was a lot of rallying calls for businesses to be able to expand, but the tone of that event, like everything that's happening at the moment, is all coloured by how, this incredibly dramatic pandemic that we're facing and the economic crisis that's created as well. The government's always been very careful when it comes to that balancing between, France versus Europe, and, France, because this government sees itself as being, putting France very much at the centre of Europe as well. I think there is more of a European approach to these things. The money that's actually in this plan for reshoring, it's €1 billion, 600 million targeted towards 5 strategic sectors, 400 million targeted towards bringing business into local, regional hubs around the country. It's only 1% of the plan, so it's a fairly small amount of money that's been put into it. But yet it has gotten so much prominence in the discourse around
because of the Yellow Vest movement.
In particular, because we've been hearing
is it because of
these measures for months.
Is it because of the Yellow Vest movement? Is it because, Emmanuel Macron faced Marine Le Pen, the far-right candidate, in the last presidential election, and could well do so again in a little under 2 years' time, and she's all for economic nationalism.
It's a very difficult one to call why the French government decided to do it. I mean, ostensibly, they've targeted sectors like health, where they want the supply chain to be shorter because they've seen the importance of producing more of those products locally. It's worth saying that France has actually been doing quite a good job in recent years of attracting foreign investment. Business France, which is the government agency that is in charge of that, has been doing very well in terms of the numbers of, in terms of numbers of investment of what they attract every year. So the trajectory has been going in the right direction really since Emmanuel Macron was elected. And I don't know how much of the politics plays into the strategy so much as just the effort of trying to attract businesses to set up here and to create jobs.
Stephen, I know you have to leave us a lot more to do and a show to prepare for tomorrow, but thanks for joining us here on the France 24 debate. As promised, let's take a closer look now at those promises of going green. $9 billion in the plan towards energy transition, including $2 billion for green hydrogen that's produced through water instead of methane or other hydrocarbon projects. Fraser Jackson has more on those going green plans in the government's proposals.
Cette station va changer les choses. Bientôt, l'hydrogène produit ici.
When Jean Lègle built this house in the 80s, energy conservation wasn't on his list of priorities. But now, with the French government spending billions of euros on an ecological overhaul, he's decided to get a piece of the action and install some insulation.
J'ai des revenus très bas, donc je vais recevoir le maximum de la prime rénov', c'est-à-dire 18 000 euros.
Jean is one of a vast number of people who can benefit from the state's latest initiative to cut greenhouse gases. Around 5 million homes in France are classed as energy guzzlers, about 17% of all residences. 7 billion euros have now been pledged to make buildings more green. And that's just a fraction of the 30 billion announced in Emmanuel Macron's latest scheme to stimulate the economy.
En fait, ce volet, il soutient la transformation écologique de tous les secteurs qui sont fortement émetteurs de gaz à effet de serre ou le plus fortement émetteur de gaz à effet de serre. Traditionnellement, on identifie 4 secteurs qui sont les transports, les bâtiments, l'énergie et l'industrie et enfin l'agriculture.
Among the new green initiatives, 11 billion euros of the 30 are going to the transport sector, half of which will transform rural railways and freight lines. Money will also go to support public transport and the building of new bike lanes. 9 billion will be spent on decarbonising industry and helping companies clean up their act. The government is hoping to reduce agriculture's reliance on pesticides and increase the amount of locally grown produce. Help will also be given to protect forests from the effects of climate change. The money will be spent over the coming years before the next presidential election in 2022.
Francesco Saracino, are you convinced?
Well, I'm not an expert in environmental transition. I mean, I think that the main issue here is not so much whether what they're doing is right, because I've been reading people who are more expert than me that say that they're acting a lot. Maybe Agnès Michel can actually answer much better than me this question. They're acting along the right lines. The problem is whether this is really part of a more global strategy, because let's not forget that while they're trying to green the economy, at the same time they're giving incentives to the car makers just to keep them alive. And this goes a little bit against the effort to, for example, move from road to rail some of the transport that we're having. So, the main issue here is whether this will be a one-off effort or is it something that will last and it will be a constant effort in the next years, even when we go back to a more normal state of affairs. Because other than that, as your newscast were saying, they're acting on the right, on the things that are more polluting and more, for example, where you have more emissions of. So, there is nothing I can say about the content of this plan. It's more a question of whether this is going to be something that is just going to be permanent. So it's an effort in the next 10 to 15 years will be constant year after year to actually move our economy and to transition our economy. And I repeat, maybe we should be careful about contradictions with other policies that the government is putting in place at the same time. But I repeat, maybe Agnès Michel is more apt than me to answer this question more precisely.
Let me ask Grégoire Chevière-Le Drian. You get an application for a proposal for financing for a plan here. You got a contradiction in terms, don't you? Because on the one hand, you want to encourage those who go green, but the best way of going green oftentimes is things like energy conservation rather than grand projects that build new stuff. So what do you do in that instance?
Let me first give you some figures, because this kind of investment are not new for France. And for instance, with the EIB perspective from Europe, we invest each year about between 8 and 9 billion each year in France, and 63 overall in Europe. 50% of this are already invested in projects that have a positive impact on climate and transition in energetical transition. And 30%, 35% within innovation. And it means that when this plan has been proposed this morning and presented to the press this morning by the Prime Minister, those priorities are already the assets of France and on Europe. So this plan will speed up and increase the investment which could be made in these sectors. And this is the role of Europe to go with and to increase our capacity to invest, to transform. And when we invest in transition ecology, and for instance, when we finance energy renovation buildings, we create jobs. So investing today in the energy transition, investing in building and renovation, this is also a way to create a lot of jobs locally based.
Agnès Michel, for years we've been told here that we're naughty school children compared to the Germans when it comes to energy transition. Does this plan put France in the same league as Germany?
In the energy category, no. It's the strategy concerning energy in France is still vague and still nuclear based. That's a fact. That's interesting to invest in new sources of energy as hydrogen. Why not? You can put it any way you want. The thing is that
2 billion euros for hydrogen. That's a lot of money.
I don't read in cards, but or in the future. But the thing is that we don't know. We don't have, most certainly we don't have the energy that would replace the petroleum, which is 95% of the energy consumed on the planet. Nuclear is a very small part of it. So there is not such thing as petroleum for the future. So what we do have to do now is to plan a society that can live with all the progress that we have achieved, but with much less energy, because we have been wasting energy for the last 100 years, but as spoiled children, and we have to convert the way we consume. So it's not as much as producing
And that conversion,
energy.
you agree with Grégoire that it is a job creator, that it does create?
Of course. That's what the ecologists have said for years now. The thing is that I really happy that now we have this renovation of buildings.
More insulation in homes.
Yeah. But why not start it like 2-3 years ago? I don't know why it lasted so long to be really launched. So what I'm saying with that is it's good that it's happening now. The thing is that I do agree with Francesco Saracino. Is it a one-shot stuff, or is it gonna last? And is it really a strategy? Is there a conversion in the mind.
Well, there is, isn't there? Because hang on. It is because there's political pressure. I don't know if you saw the results of the municipal elections.
Oh, yes, I
did.
did.
All the major cities in France where the Greens have taken over City Hall.
Of course, and I'm so glad. I've seen them grow. I mean, I'm really happy.
Enough, though? Isn't that enough to say, well, France is definitely on this path now?
The thing is that it's two dances. I don't know. You know, they make a 2 step ahead, 2 step.
2 steps forward, 1 step backwards, or 2 step backwards?
I said 2 and 2 for now, because they are the neonicotine. I really don't know how to say it. Even in France, the pesticides that has been allowed another time. There is the car support, the car industry support, and so it's like we try to create something new, but we still invest a lot in the old economy. And at this point, we have a great opportunity. I mean, for all due respect for the deaths, for the people that have suffered with the COVID and that will suffer with the COVID. But at this point, when you are a politician, you have to make choices because you are facing a kind of warning. I won't say that the Earth, Gaia and stuff is making a warning on the planet, but it's a warning as to say, maybe tomorrow, we are going to be confronted to something, an ecological catastrophe. And it's going to be the same kind of catastrophe that we have experimented this year. So what do we do? Are we changing the way we consume, we live, we interact in a way to protect everyone, meaning our environment as well, and the ability to live on a day basis with us spending less energy, less materials? Or are we going to do business as usual, but with a little bit of green paint? That's the question. At this moment, today, I think that the French politician, the French government, is still between two.
All right, it's too soon to say is what you're saying.
I'm just hoping that
the pressure will
next time I will be here, it's going to be 2 steps ahead and only 1.
Before we go, one of the big game changers, if you will, from this crisis, from all this lockdown, was that, well, we spent a lot of time in front of screens during confinement. While Europe reels from its worst recession in decades, this week we learned that Wall Street enjoyed its best month of August since 1984. With the tech-heavy NASDAQ index breaking records, same as the S&P 500. Big winners including the likes of those GAFAs, that is Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon. You can add to that list companies such as Microsoft and Zoom. Francesco Saracino, we saw in France's plan for stimulus tax cuts for businesses. Would you have liked to have seen this issue of the giant profits made by digital giants addressed in the plan?
Well, yes, of course I would have liked it. I understand why it's not there, though, because I mean this is not something that an individual country, even a large country like France, can do. I mean, the issue of, well, it's a much more vast issue actually than just the GAFAs. I mean, we need to think about how to tax multinationals, how to avoid the tax profits shifting from country to country, and basically how to make these large multinational companies pay their due of taxes, because I mean they make, as you said, huge profits. This is a global issue. The OECD is working on that. The European Union is working on that. There is opposition because some European countries are actually taking advantage of these loopholes in the legislation to attract businesses. But I mean, there have been some attempts by France itself, by Italy, by other countries to introduce small taxes on the profits of large corporations. But I mean, this is not the job for an individual country. I mean, I think it's time that Europe takes this issue as a top priority, because as somebody was saying today on Twitter, I saw that passing, I mean, we cannot even start discussing common fiscal policies, the recovery plan and things like that, if we don't address the asymmetries and the discrepancies in tax legislations on corporate tax legislation across Europe, and I would say across advanced countries. I mean, the fact that the OECD and the Commission are working on very similar proposals is a very good news, but there are lots of oppositions, and we need to, that is the court where we have to fight the battle and to play the game. That France taxes large corporations would have been completely ineffective. So I'm not surprised it's not there. But it should be a top priority for Europe as a whole and for the OECD.
And for France. Let me turn to Grégoire Chauvière-Le Drian, because we've seen this digital acceleration, right, since the month of March. The big have gotten bigger. A group like the European Investment Bank, what do you think in terms of what needs to be done to protect the small businesses that are so essential for any economy?
Actually, we didn't wait for the European Recovery Plan to come up with a solution. And since April, we proposed to our shareholders, which are the member states, to launch a guarantee fund. The idea was to avoid any credit crunch and to avoid the situation that we faced with in 2008 and 2010. And we proposed to set up this guarantee fund to allow all the banks to work as they have to do and to finance the real economy. And since April, Europe proposed the EU package with a pillar dedicated to real economy.
And is that money getting to small businesses?
It started, actually. Since July, the first operation has been approved and implemented. And that's why I would like to insist on the capacity of the EU to provide a response rapidly and efficiently.
All right, Grégoire Chauvière-Le Drian, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank Agnès Michel, Francesco Saracino. We want to thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.